I'm Leo.
I'm Alan.
I'm Sam.
We are Group 5.
Hello, I'm Leo. Today I'm going to share with you my answers. The first question is about how the pandemic would affect the aggregate demand curve in Taiwan. First, we should know that the aggregate demand curve is determined by LM and IS curve. And because the IS curve is affected by the national income, the fluctuation in the national income can indirectly affect aggregate demand curve. During the COVID-19 pandemic, consumption decreases because people avoid dining outside or traveling. Investment decreases because company reduces the purchases of equipment and inventory to meet the expectation of the falling sale. Last but not least, given that Taiwan normally enjoys trade surplus, the halt of world trade brought by the pandemic decreased our net exports. Therefore, the IS curve shifts to the left, which in turn shifts the aggregate demand curve leftward. So, in what way will Taiwan's economy be affected by the pandemic? For starters, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, which is deduced from the previous reasoning. Subsequently, the price level falls. However, the nominal wage adjusts slowly to the fall. In the near future, sale becomes less profitable. As a result, companies reduce the production scale and hire fewer employees. Therefore, as observed on the diagram, the output falls. After a while, when the nominal wage adjusts to the expectation, companies become more willing to hire more employees and increases the output. In the long run, the decrease in the aggregate demand curve causes deflation and leave output unchanged. Just as I mentioned, in the short run, the serious unemployment rate is threatening the society. So what should the government do to minimize the impact? Theoretically, there are two arguments. The first one says that the government can simply do nothing and leave the automatic stabilizer work itself. The second one says that government should be actively involved and shift back the aggregate demand curve by encouraging investment and consumption. Some practical idea like money injection or lowering interest rate. It is still open to debate about which one is more effective. However, we can't deny that most governments do something. After all, people tend to believe the one who is at least trying to do something. How about Taiwan? What exactly did the Taiwanese government propose to deal with the crisis? Here I list 4 policies. The first one is the compensation package, which I'll explain in the next question. The second one is to make loans to companies at a low interest rate. During the pandemic, companies may lose their money in the operating cycle. By lending money at low interest rate, the government helps companies to finance. The third one is to postpone the collection of the rent for land. For companies in export processing zone and industrial zone, the government has postponed the collection of the rent for land. The last one is the distribution of coupon. It is conceivable that people will buy more stuff when they receive extra money. So the distribution of the coupon is aimed at encouraging consumption. So let's focus on the unemployment compensation package. Remember that when the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, with price level falling, companies respond by hiring fewer people. More and more people will lose their jobs before the aggregate supply adjusts to the expected level. In order to soften the blow of the rising unemployment rate, the government offers more unemployment compensation for the employees and employers. Of course, there are some criteria for the applicants. For example, for companies who want to apply for the compensation, they should have experienced 50% reduction in sales. And by doing this, the government won't overspend their budget.
Okay, let's talk about trade war. And there are three reasons causing trade war. They are trade deficits, unfair trading practices, and intellectual property concerns. And let me introduce the details about them. Trade deficits. By 1984, the United States had become China's third largest trading partner, and China became America's 14th largest one. This has been accompanied by a relatively low savings ratio and high levels of government and corporate debt, causing economic slowdown. And you can see in the diagram, there are increasing trade deficits between China and US. And trading practice. This is because China put large tariffs on imported goods, making American exported goods are less favorable. Also, it leads to increasing trade deficit. The third one is intellectual property concern. Since China failed to abide by the global regulations, among the thorny issues were that China was a major source of pirated musical compacted discs and video laser discs, along with virtually all the computer software sold in China. On intellectual property rights, there was no enforcement of China written laws, and as a result, there are the prevalence of piracy and violating intellectual property rights. And let's talk about USA market. The left picture shows three diagrams, which symbolize the equilibrium situation. From the beginning, for USA, tariffs on imported goods increased net exports, and capital flow denotes that people tend to buy the USA assets, and thus decreases America's net capital outflow. From these two reasons, we can understand that demand for loanable funds shifts to the left. And you can see the right picture. The first diagram, point A moved to the point B, reducing the interest rate. The third one shows point A moved to the point B, which indicates increasing real exchange rate. Let's see how market for China works. The first three diagrams symbolize the China equilibrium status quo. From the beginning, for China, USA's tariffs make China more difficult to export, thus decrease net exports. Capital flow denotes that people tend to buy the USA assets, and thus increases China's net capital outflow. The right picture shows the demand for loanable funds shift to the right. The third one showed black point move to the blue point, causing nominal exchange rate to decrease. Talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Since net exports decreases in the short run, it will move the aggregate demand to the left. In the diagram, you can find that Q moves to the Q star, meaning that real GDP decreases, and P moves to the P star, which denotes that decrease of price level. Final part, let's discuss our standpoint against the Trump's policy. We disagree with his policy because it will cause two countries to drop into the vicious circle and lead to economic instability. People are susceptible to higher rates and thus curb the economic development. And trade war not only affects these two countries, it also does damage to other countries' economy at large.
I'm Alan. Now I'm going to share with you our third question. That is, in the past decade, the quantitative easing policy was often used by the Fed in the United States. As a matter of fact, Japan and EU also engaged quantitative easing policies before. So, what is quantitative easing policy? It is 量化宽松, a form of unconventional monetary policy in which a central bank, for example Fed in the US, purchases longer-term securities from the open market in order to increase the money supply, encourage lending and investment, so that the society can eventually recover from recession. When short-term interest rates are either at or approaching zero, the normal open market operations of a central bank are no longer effective. The interest rate can't decrease more to give investors incentives to invest, which will not expand economic activities. In this case, QE helps to continue the stimulation of the economy. Here is the diagram of market for loanable funds. As you can see, if the money supply increases from M2 to M3, since the real interest rate is already too low, it doesn't go down, so investors will not want to invest more, and this is so-called the liquidity trap. This is also the situation using QE to boost economy. The actions of QE increases the excess reserves that banks hold. Banks compete with each other with lower interest rate to lend out money. The goal of the policy is to ease financial conditions, increase market liquidity, and facilitate an expansion of private bank lending. However, risks include the policy being more effective than intended in acting against deflation, which may lead to higher inflation in the longer term, or not being effective enough if banks remain reluctant to lend because credibility of companies become less certain, or potential borrowers are unwilling to borrow. Since we said that QE is an unconventional method, how about the difference between the quantitative easing policy and the conventional monetary policy? To be general, the two categories differ in the scale and the assets that central banks use as an intermediary. While conventional monetary policy can increase or decrease money supply, QE only increases money supply. Under conventional policies, central banks often buy government bonds, whereas central banks buy riskier mortgage-backed securities and corporate bonds to influence the interest rate in different markets of financial assets under QE. One well-known example and also the start of Fed using the quantitative easing policy in response to a crisis in the United States happened after the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers Holdings Incorporation in 2008. The stock markets fell drastically, trade and businesses froze. Banks stopped issuing letters of credit to former trusted partners worldwide, since no one knew who was bankrupt and who wasn't. In order to fight the monsters of deflation and depression, central banks and governments then saved the day by printing money, providing almost unlimited amounts of liquidity to the financial system. Some people say that the money printing progress was entirely appropriate in order to avoid the Great Depression number 2. The initial crisis is long gone, but the unconventional measures have stayed with us. Central bankers kept on creating money. Usually, interest rates move up or down depending on growth and inflation. Higher growth and inflation normally means higher rates, and lower growth means lower rates. Those were the good old days when things were normal, but now central bankers in the United States, Japan, and Europe have pinned interest rates close to zero and promised to leave them there for years. Keep using the quantitative easing method. Here are the examples of QE still controlling the money supply, with huge amounts of billions and trillions. It is responsible to conclude that QE will keep affecting our economy. Using the market for loanable funds model can explain how the quantitative easing policy solved the problem. When central banks increase the money supply, at the new equilibrium level, the interest rate falls and more people would like to borrow money to invest.
The European debt crisis refers to a crisis in the banking system of the European countries using euros in 2009. At that time, many governments lost their ability to pay back the debt. But how did that happen? Generally, it was a chain effect triggered by debt crisis of pigs. Around 2007 to 2008, the world was suffering the financial crisis. In order to spur the growth of the economy, many European countries were making deficit spending. However, the economy in pigs couldn't save itself despite the loosening fiscal policy. This was in part attributable to the unified exchange rate fixed by the EU, which could otherwise be employed to gain the trading advantages. So without the tool of exchange rate and interest rate, the government can only deal with its sluggish economy by conducting more and more deficit spending. The situation was so grave that the government could only pay back their debt by taking out new loan. And the last straw of the crisis was the subprime mortgage crisis in the United States. In the wake of the economic meltdown in the United States, investors lost confidence in the market and raised interest rates. From then on, countries like pigs lost the ability to pay back their debt, and the sovereign debt crisis thus happened. Next, I'll analyze the impacts on the following macroeconomic variables. With the default rate in the Eurozone skyrocketing, investors withdrew their capital from the Eurozone. This led to the increase in net capital outflow. So, as we can see on the diagram, in the loanable fund market, the demand curve, which includes net capital outflow, shifts to the right. Subsequently, the interest rate is pushed up. Also, the increased net capital outflow and interest rate together cause the real interest rate to decrease. Finally, the next exports will increase.
The last question, I'm going to simply share with you about two important economists, Keynes and Hayek. Their extremely different views on economics have prompted debates between their supporters. Keynes is a member of the classical school. His ideas fundamentally changed the theory and practice of the economic policies of governments. He advocated the use of fiscal and monetary policies to mitigate the adverse effects of economic recessions and depressions. He detailed these ideas in his book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. Keynes also built on and greatly improved earlier work on the causes of business cycles. The Economist, which is an international newspaper, has described him as Britain's most famous 20th century economist. Hayek is from the Austrian school. He received 1974 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, pioneering work in the theory of money and economic fluctuations. He is also a philosopher best known for his defense of classical liberalism. A part of it emphasizes on economic freedom. His account of how changing prices communicate information that helps individuals coordinate their plans is widely regarded as an important achievement in economics. As you can see, this is a contrast table. For Keynes, through the multiplier effect, increasing the government spending by, let's say, $100 can shift the aggregate demand curve right for more than $100, which means that government should carry out policies to keep the short-run economy from great fluctuations. He wants people to stop saving, or the economy will never grow. One last interesting point of view of his is that we don't have to care about the long run because we're all dead at that time. And for Hayek, he cares more about the economy in the long run. Excessive budget deficit is not good for the economy. So he believes that the market will meet its own equilibrium without government intervention. Also, saving money and to get the interest rates is his suggestions to the public. Blame the central banks for keeping the interest rates low, he said. Okay, this is the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening.